curiously, it brings me back to this question of performance, oddly enough, or re-performance, because one of the reasons to perform or re-perform anything is to have a physical experience of what it is like to be doing something in a certain way. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I can see that by painting as Sophie La Rosière, like creating sculptures as Mary O'Shea, you are physically recapitulating an experience that you have no access to other than through written narratives. And it seems to me that that's potentially a very powerful experience for you and therefore indirectly for us, because it's very evident from a viewer's point of view that in order to create the work you've created, you've undergone enormous labors to put yourself mentally into the time that you're trying to paint as or create as, and also just the sheer physical studio time that it takes to build an endeavor of any kind. So I feel that performance is in question not in the superficial sense of pretending, which is what people often think of when they first go to performance, but this other idea of being in something.
Thank you for saying that. I think you have a point. Also, I don't want to have overlooked that and every writer and many here in the room and artists know that when you slip into a different character, you give yourself a scale of permission that can go beyond your artistic description, skills, or title or whatever, because you admit to be just in the schlepptau, in the dragged by somebody who is actually bigger, somebody who has lived through something, and then doing with your hands something that you could not anticipate with your mind beforehand, 100%, is like so powerful and so strong that, like, for example, it lets you become a painter. I freaking never learned how to paint. I was actually looking down at painters because I thought sculptors are the guys who do things with their body, and painters, you know, they do this, till I needed to become a painter. And now I have the deepest respect for anyone who paints. And I stopped painting after the Sophie La Rosière project. There's no painting coming anymore. She gave it to me and she took it from me.
So we've talked a little bit about how you're addressing, certainly to some degree, traumatic histories, partly because of this traumatic background of your own family and cultural history, unresolved traumas, unspoken stories of the war period in particular. Do you think that there's a way this kind of work allows us to come closer to traumatic histories without pushing our face in them, so to speak? I mean, there's a way in which all of your characters, like Sophie, Florence, not all of them, but a lot of them have these terrible stories.
Yeah.
And yet it's not like the catharsis of a Hallmark television program where you get to, you know, cry and be done in the Aristotelian sense at the end. There's that's almost cut off because of you're being asked instead to be a kind of surrogate witness, as though you're almost present, almost part of the story, so that you have a particular kind of connection to trauma that's not too emotionally fraught, but it's also close enough to be uncomfortable, perhaps.
It's also uncomfortable for me at times. And God, how do I start? What did you ask?
I didn't ask it very clearly. I apologize.
So I'm interested in creativity as a personal tool to address trauma, but not in an analytical way. I mean, I would love to, but I don't have the education for that and the skills. I'm interested in trauma finding its way in the most simple, sometimes naive appearing obsessive works that are conducted by somebody who has no choice. But with having this no choice and we witnessing him from the outside, we can start appreciating what's happening. And so in our mind, or in my mind to say it in the first person, I get respect for somebody who doesn't give up, but just continues and tries to find a language, and tries to find a language beyond the spoken word, because he or she might not, or they might not be articulated enough, or able to speak, or socially permitted to speak, or historically have a place where they would have an audience. Like, they are all people who haven't been voiced in my little thinking of the world.
And then one of the things I'm really connecting to here is the idea that not only are these people speaking through you, Sophie, but their environments are speaking. They're speaking through their environments. You're creating a lot of things that are speaking for them in a kind of choral. It's almost like a chorus that you create. I'm wondering, there's one of the words that comes up often in these conversations is channeling, this idea that we are channeling some of these people into their fictive histories. But there's also a feeling that once you've created a large life and gotten invested in a person, how do you stop? How do you not keep creating new people for them to run into, new places for them to go, new bodies of work for them to move into, right?
You would wish for. No, it happens. So Joseph Wagenbach is now 92, right? And I haven't put a death date on him. And I catch myself walking the streets and thinking, this figure could be one of Joseph's friends, right? And so there are some characters who I leave open, because they are just not. It's like when some relationships we have in life, we abandon, some we cut, and some we let fade out and pick up later when we have evolved, or when the other person is ready for another phase. So the current Florence Hazard, who was born in 1882, she is having an encounter that I didn't know till last November, that she would have an encounter and basically cheat on Sophie and have a fling in Paris in 1909 with a real historical figure. So she comes basically back, and she had been in Brooklyn, she had been in Milwaukee. I make her a woman who dares, although her conditions would not think us that she can dare, that she emigrates, that she somehow masters that. And then she comes back to me and proves she can. So some have a death date, like Ellen Stanley, or some have and some have not. Not all of them. And it's interesting, in preparing for this talk, Antoinette, I thought I should actually know how many fictitious characters there are, right? And of course I don't know. But what I did is I made a little list, and I noticed that all my characters in Germany before I immigrated to Canada, and these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they have basically no names. They have not a detailed biography. They were vague. And then the fictitious characters that start in North America, they become much more detailed and fleshed out, and they are allowed to take on personality. So you tell me why that is.
I have no guess, I have to say. I only have a couple more questions before I want to turn this over to our audience for their questions. But one of them, it has to do with this question of truth-telling that often comes up with these kinds of fictive art projects, where there's a people don't know that it's not true. They think it's true, and then when they find out that it's partly fictional, they often get angry. And I'm wondering, do you ever talk directly to people about this sort of central issue in the work? Because I know that you've said you've gotten letters and you've even used them in your books, positive responses, negative responses, the whole 9 yards. How do you talk to people about this question of truth in these projects?
I first have to say as a preface that I sometimes, particularly recently, I present the work as by Iris Haussler, and people still get lost in it and then think that Sophie Larosière and Florence are real, but Iris Haussler is an invention. So that proves to me that never underestimate your audience. But the thing that you asked came upon a call basically when the AGO did the work with, had me commissioned, and they got an amazing backlash. I mean, people wanted their tickets back. They dropped their memberships. They wrote to Matthew Teitelbaum. They accused the AGO of being funded by taxpayers, and they wanted Iris Haussler, her tongue cut out. I got a death threat. That was really, it was also that people wrote their thesis about it and so on and so on. But so what the AGO did, they just forwarded me all the telephone numbers and the emails of these people. So what I did was thinking, wait a moment. And so I took 2 nights a week where I went through all these phone numbers and I phoned and I said, hello, I heard you had been to the installation He Named Her Amber at the AGO. My name is Iris Haussler. I'm happy to talk with you. And then some people would hang up. But what I learned is that when I listen, when I allow them to tell me how painful it was to think that is real, to think there is a discovery, I understood their pain. I mean, I had anticipated it, but I understood it much better. And then we, in the good situations, and not all were good, but many were surprisingly good, that people and we were able to say, so what actually changed? The artifacts are the same, the exhibition is the same, and some people just said, yeah, you can't take that away from me. That was the best thing I saw. It was like they claimed it, and it made me really grateful. And some actually, a big number, then became the unannounced docent. They would come back with family members, not tell the family members or the friends, and then watch them to get the disclosure or the little sheet or have it delivered to them and have to read it over a cup of tea and say, edge up edge, you know? And then they had discussion on the dinner tables. And that shows me that if we treat people with the respect that we all deserve, it can work out. And another thing is that the press calls it a hoax. Most people don't, and the press does it because it's sensational. But if I look at what I do, if I try to allow myself to be to step out of it, I would say I'm loyal to truth. I just use different methods. It's like a jester on a court who tells the truth by different stories, but so that they can be heard. And now the messenger, of course, is in danger to be hanged. And you know what? I can take that. So far.
So far, indeed. Can you close this little section of the talk by just giving us a little glimpse of what you're working on now? Do you have a new or current project that you're ready to talk about at all?
Yeah. Thank you for asking, Antoinette. I'm working on a project that is a bit different because I'm interweaving a historical real figure, Benjamin Kolbe, who was the wife of a sculptor who has now, his studio is now a museum in Berlin. And the museum invites me to, or commissions me to basically bring more blood, more flesh, more life into this historical figure that is just known as the muse, as the mother, and as the partner. And so the challenge is that I will, as I said, give her this encounter with Florence Haussler, but I have to do that in a way that is respectful. And it means I have to label this part of the work. So what I came up with is that I make it first very concrete, and I started writing love letters from Florence to Benjamine. And so I have many fragments of love letters that I wrote in German. Then I translated them in English. Then I have edited them to be correct. And then I had translated them by Catherine Sicot, who was once my partner in crime, into French. And I got them back, and then I wrote them. I actually have them behind me, handwritten of old paper with ink pen. And what I will do to basically fog this work, this body of work that is called If, and that will be amongst work of Florence and Sophie in a couple of vitrines of showcases, I'm encasing it in wax. And by encasing it in wax, you basically have something absolute concrete, and then you take it away from the eye. It becomes, you can sense it, you can think about it. With other information, you can piece it together, but it lost its detailed photographic trace. And that's what I'm doing right now.
The fog of history. That's great. I love that image.
And it will open March 3rd, so COVID allows, in Berlin, in the Georg Kolbe Museum.
So everybody who thinks they might be in Berlin, take note. Gordy, do we have some questions from our audience?
Actually, we do have a couple questions, and we've got a good audience, and we've got two good questions. One is from Beauvais Lyons, who will be, he's a participant in your book, I believe. Beauvais asks, can you talk about the experience of working with the docents for He Named Her Amber? How much was their tour scripted, or if not, what license did you give them to extend the fiction?
Okay, first of all, you can never fire a docent. I didn't know that. Most of these docents were amazing. They did the work. They brought this piece to life in a kind of convincement that I stood behind a curtain, and I was completely believing in the story. So there is a lot of talent. However, I had a script, and it's actually in the He Named Her Amber book. And I allowed the docents, because it was so complex, because the servant had lived there for decades and it was a complex story, to basically just tell it in their own. And some do that, of course, amazingly, and they were also bilingual. Some of them were able to do it in French at that time. But there are people who start telling their own life story. And there are people who did say one sentence wrong, and I needed to go in and have retraining. They please, please, please never say this sentence. They said, I had a sentence saying, Mary O'Shea collected the drippings of beeswax, and instead of bringing it back to the retreating pot in the kitchen, she put it in her apron and collected it. And so people would, some of the docents would, not many, but it would happen, say, she stole beeswax. And like, you cannot do that. The Irish were so discriminated in Canada already. And then 150 years later, that's when I say you can never fire a docent. You have to work and engage with the people. Does that answer the question?
I think that does. Robert Everett Green asks, if we are talking about performance, how could we not also talk outright about theater and particularly the construction of character employed by actors, method actors or not, and how that may be performed in 3 dimensions through Iris's creations of her fictive characters?
I cannot answer that question, but I guess Robert can. He must have a theory.
I don't know. But Heather Jessup asks, have you ever had artist character personas come to you, Iris, that you've had to turn away for any reason, whose art you couldn't bring into being? If so, why?
Yeah, I had that. I feel that this question is almost too intimate, because there were characters who asked me to do something that I said yes, and I couldn't do it. And then I had to take authorship. I never killed one, but I altered them. So I had that. Yes, it happens.
Interesting. Sarah Diamond asks, I've been researching artists' work with archives and archives who create imaginary archives. Artists have created works to challenge the veracity of the archives, and these practices continue. Can you think about the archive and the need to rethink it, and where your work fits into this context?
What was the last sentence? Can you
speak about the archive and the need to rethink it, and where your work fits into this context?
So if anything at my work is ever fake, because everything is true, everything has a physical existence, but one thing that might be fake to my terribility is my archive. I archive everything, and I'm so terrible at this job. There's no bookkeeper in the world who is worse than me. There is nobody who is so inconsistent. There is nobody who is so over all the place and does label shelves and put the things not where the labels are, and puts labels on works that are actually not the works the labels were meant for. I am not envying anyone who will ever have to deal with that.
Yes. Imaginary or
But I have an archive. I have a huge archive.
I think also Sarah was asking a little bit about the artists who create imaginary archives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that actually is a question I can answer better, because I have another character at work who we might meet years and years, who created, who started recording of bird migration incidents, and started an archive that went from drawings into writing it down in books, and went into real observations. So yeah, I don't know if I would have now to comb through my old work, and as I said, my memory is so bad, I forget my own work. But
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I think this is really interesting, and I'm grateful that Sarah Diamond brought this up. Iris, I'm thinking about the Sophie Larosière book, and how everything in it, also the Amber book, everything in it seemed to have an archive number and to have been organized as if by curatorial experts. Now, is that something you imposed on it as part of the process, or can you talk about that a little bit?
I do. I love masking tape. I always have masking tape, and I put masking tape and labels on everything, only to then, if nobody helps me with that or takes over, it will never go there. But the book was done with the AGO and with Jim Shedden and David Mose, and there were many people involved. And the Sophie Larosière book, Philip Monk, who is just fascinating, amazing brain, was basically not only editing, I would say designing that book, and had the whip that he put on me to basically make these numbers match the artworks. Only to then basically question that 12 of the works are not from Sophie, they are actually from Florence Hazard, and then we put those in red numbers. So an archive has even been allowed to have the pliability in the time of making before it went into print, into a book. And the reason why I actually allow myself to be a little bit cavalier with archives is because I'm very aware that as long as we have not given everything up to algorithms, and even those are created by humans, even archives are actually not objective. They are subjective. There is a person beyond who does the selection. And I often question that. I question where history is told by survivors, heroes tell their stories, and what about the people who were not asked to be in a selection process, invited or in charge? And we in Canada, with the reconciliation process, we see right now how amazingly important it is to keep this all open and to allow other people to put their stories right and to tell their stories and to create archives.
Yeah, I can see how tempting it might be after you've created a body of work, say, as Sophie Larosière or as Florence César, whoever, to then step back a few months later, put on a curator's hat and sort of come back to it with this new creative project as I'm going to organize it and I'm going to change the story, because curatorial and archival projects often change the story. As you say, they take works out of the oeuvre, they interpret them completely differently, and so it seems to me that it could be part of a multi-stage process for you.
It is absolutely right. So allow me something very weird to show you an old sketchbook. I don't know if you can see that. This is so when I did Sophie Larosière, I went through all my sketchbooks and I decided, oh, that could be a drawing of hers, and that could be a drawing of hers. And so these ended up in the book, in Philip Monkey's book, so to speak, right? And now with this project in Berlin, I went through their archive, because damn, the Germans, you know, they do archives right. So they have an archive of Georg Kolbe, all his work. It's a Werkverzeichnis, it's numbered, and it's digital. And I found a drawing of his from 1909 where a model has exactly this this attitude, this position. And this is done in 1909 by Sophie. So these two drawings will be juxtaposed in the exhibition. And I just dare to reach into that. And there are many other drawings in this thing that will never be considered, right? So this is the freedom which you talk about. Is it a freedom, or did I misunderstood you?
No, I think it is a freedom. Exactly what I think it is. It's part of a creative freedom that you're allowing yourself, and that's a wonderful example. Thank you. Gordy, how are we? Do we have more questions?
I believe we do. Iris, I think is fascinating that in a sense, by creating fictitious history, you're creating real history.
Thank you. Thank you.
Today has been such a pleasure. And Iris, it was great to meet you. Again, thank you for joining us, Professor LaFarge. This is great. And I've learned so much today. And also I've realized how much more I need to learn. And many thanks to DoppelHouse Press for publishing this fine book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation. Now, coming up in our series on fictive art, Professor LaFarge will speak with artist Beauvais Lyons on January 12th and artist Lenore Malin on March 2nd. Both discussions will begin at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so please join us. Again, thank you for coming today. This is Gordy Grundy for ArtReportToday.com, wishing you a good night.